Hello, welcome back to Our Bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Morehouse. So we've got another author interview today. We're talking food history with food historian Dr. Annie Gray. She's written a book called Victory in the Kitchen, The Life of Georgina, Churchill's cook. Georgina is a lady who grew up just down the road in the little hamlet of Albury. She was born there as well. So a little local element to this particular video. And she'll be interviewed by a good friend of ours, Audrey Deane.
Thanks for that, Ben. Morning, Annie.
Hello.
How you doing? Are you well?
Well, the sun's shining, the rain's gone away, the garden looks good. We're still in lockdown, which is pretty hideous, but apart from that,
I know it's not an easy time at the minute, but a perfect time to have a chat about your new book.
Yeah, I'm very proud of my new book. It's I think it's perfect lockdown reading, obviously, although I would say that having written it. But I think it's one of those books, because it's a biography, and it's a biography of a working class, very ordinary woman. I think it's a good reminder that lives are lives. We don't have to be the great and the good and the rich and the famous in order to somehow achieve something. We can all just soldier through our lives, the bad, the good, the really, really ugly, and look back on it and hopefully say, do you know what? That was all right. That was a life well lived.
Well, she certainly, if anyone who does eventually read the book, she certainly did a lot of that. And I found it really fascinating that obviously she's a local girl.
Yes, born in Albury, grew up very much Aston Clinton, Tring, Albury. That sort of triangle was really the background to her early life.
Yeah, no, I found that really fascinating. I didn't realise that at all when I started reading it, and it was like, oh. So a lot of people in our area, a lot of Tring people, will find it quite familiar, some of the stories and some of the sort of pictures that it conjures up.
Well, I did a research trip down in the middle of winter. It was February and it was snowing, and it was a brilliant day because we started off in Aston Clinton. Obviously the house there, the Rothschild house there, no longer exists.
Yeah.
Drove over to Tring, went to the Natural History Museum, which was probably the highlight of the research, to be honest. Just brilliant. And I was like, how did I never know this existed? This is just the best thing. Looked at the cassowaries, bought a mug, and then went over to Tring, had lunch in the pub, which her relatives ended up running, and went around the graveyard as well, at which point all the people with me decided that the snow was too much for graveyard hunting and all went back to the pub. But it was a really interesting day, and I think very useful because it's a really evocative thing to do, to go and tread in the footsteps of the person that you're studying. And even though you're obviously treading on modern roads in a modern context, and nothing is really the same in terms of the social context now of Albury and Tring versus what it was like in the 1880s, it still does give you a sense of place, and I think a sense of person, and being able to identify the house that she was born in as well. I wouldn't have been able to do that from Google Street View. You had to sort of tread in those roads and pick up in the tiny clues in the memoir that she left and work out where it was. So it was quite an exciting day, I think, from my point of view.
No, that's good. You were very welcome to come to Tring, and we take it for granted, our museum. I have to say, it's at the bottom of my road, and I just spent most of my children's life in there. When it rained, we would go into the zoo and have a look round. And I also, I did think I knew quite a lot about Tring, but even I learned quite a lot having read certainly the first part of the book. And it really struck me that, it was really quite poor here. Obviously, we were a rural market town. The whole Strawplatting thing was going on, and that was really a lot of people's main income, particularly women and young children. And it just struck me that, how on earth did she get out of that? How on earth did her family find their way into service?
I think it's really easy to forget how rural parts of Britain that now are quite urban were at the time. So we think today of Tring and Albury. I mean, I lived in Princes Risborough for a while, and effectively it was almost a suburb of London. Everybody who lived there commuted. So it's really hard to visualise places sometimes as very, very unconnected, and that's despite the railway line. But the Strawplatting, I think, is another trap that people tend to fall into, is to think that rural also means very, very poor. If you were a straw platter, you were really well off, because it was a women's occupation and because women could earn as much as men doing it. Actually, the areas around Luton, Dunstable, Tring, those places with a thriving straw platting industry, the women there and the families therefore were much, much better off than an awful lot of other rural families. If you were, say, married to a gamekeeper, he might be earning £50 a year. I mean, that's right at the top of the working class wage. But then if you are the gamekeeper's wife and you can earn another £40 a year strawplatting, something that in another rural environment you wouldn't be able to do. You might take in washing or do a bit of kind of daily char work for a local house, but there's no way you'd be earning £40 a year. So in Tring, those families were well off. They were really, really affluent working class, the kind of backbone of that type of rural Britain. But by 1882, when Georgina was born, the strawplatting industry was in decline. So had she been born 40 years earlier, as her mother was, she almost certainly would have gone into strawplatting and grown up and stayed in Albury. But times were changing, straw was coming in from abroad, that industry was no longer what it was. So she didn't really have the choice. And when it comes to domestic service, I mean, it was the biggest employer of women. It's one of the things, the more you study service, the more you realise it is the history of women, and the history of women is in some ways the history of domestic service. It's a really huge area for women's studies. And so in some ways it's inevitable that she went into it, because that's what so many girls did. On the other hand, none of her siblings went into domestic service. So it's she stands at this kind of really interesting turning point in British history, where more and more people are going into the service industry, where they're becoming shopkeepers and postmistresses and telegraphonists and all sorts of things. But she follows in her mother's footsteps because her mother had been in domestic service. So as a child, you usually look at what you know, and you think, oh, my mum's a teacher, my dad's a librarian, my aunt's a whatever. Oh, well, I'll maybe go and do that too. And that's what she did. So she went into an area that her mother had been in, that one of her aunts was in as well. And that was very easy to access at that point, because you sort of went into it through who you knew, both on your own social level and also on the social level above.
Yes, and that comes through in this. I mean, obviously people who live in Tring are very, very familiar with the Rothschilds. You know, it's all around us, and you know, it's very, very ingrained in Tring life. And again, you know, I think it seems like the connections with people like the Rothschilds, as you say, sort of above you in the hierarchy, that was key to them moving on and into London and getting into that circle of domestic service.
Yeah, society was very intermeshed, and if you were an aristocrat and you had a large house, or even if you had a middle-sized house, like the Wards in Albury, then you would have a kind of duty to the people around you. So if you have the classic kind of model of the country house, there's no welfare state in the 1880s. So who provides welfare? Who is providing the poor with a means to eat and a means to stay warm? Well, that duty falls upon the chatelaine, the mistress of the country house. So country houses didn't occupy a space that was kind of insular and of its own. They very much spread out into the local community. And one of those key functions was to provide a conduit for people in the local area to come into employment. In terms of domestic service, it was normal to employ girls in particular from outside the locality, because it was felt that if you employed a local girl, they'd steal your food and take it to their parents, and there was a temptation and it was too easy to run away and that kind of thing. But what would happen instead was that aristocrats would perhaps use a girl as a day girl, or a girl would start at the local rectory, who of course the rector or the vicar would know the next person up the scale, and they'd recommend that person. And so a girl would kind of get experience working day by day and going home in the evenings, and then get her first away from home position, usually with someone further away in the locality. And because all of the aristocracy, all of the upper classes really converged on certain social centres, be it London, Bath, Cheltenham, Harrogate, you know, Buxton Spa, all these centres that we've all heard of. People gather together, they talk to each other, they work out who needs servants, and the servants themselves get together in those areas as well and say, well, actually, I'm looking to move up. Well, that's all right, because I've heard that Lady so-and-so is recruiting, so she's looking for a second kitchen maid. Are you ready for that? I'll have a word with the housekeeper, who will have a word with her housekeeper, who'll have a word with her. So there's all these really intricate little chains of being, and word of mouth and personal recommendation plays as big a role, if not a bigger role, than the agencies and the newspaper adverts that are also used to find servants at the time.
Yeah, so huge networking going on at that time. An early LinkedIn.
Fewer photographs.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And so it was very normal to be recommended around the houses.
Yes, it was, and that's how most people got their start, really. I mean, with Georgina, Her family worked right across Albury, and her father worked for Cyril Flower, who was married to one of the Rothschilds. So even her parents had those connections. And when she eventually went into service, it was almost certainly within spitting distance of her parents' house. They were by then living in London, in Kensington Palace Gardens. So that's probably where she started. And then after she'd done her first stint in the kitchen, she'll have heard about what was happening next, moved on. So it really was important to have a good network and good relationships, both with your peers as well as the people above you. And that kind of really personal nature of service and of how you got a new job was absolutely crucial.
Yeah, that sounds like she did really well for herself, because she, as you quite rightly point out, you know, she starts off at quite a good position in the kitchen, you know, and has never even been in one before.
No, it's remarkable. She gets taken on as number 6. I mean, already that's a house of some substance. There's, I think, a kind of view of domestic service of everybody working in country houses. It's a sort of Downton effect, that's what a servant's life was. But 75% of servants worked in houses of 1 or 2 people, 1 or 2 servants, I should say. So really that sort of middle class level. And servant keeping was ubiquitous. Just as today, a lot of people have cleaners, but don't really regard themselves as servant keepers. Back in the Victorian era, they would have had a live-in servant, and it just was relatively natural thing to do. Even the upper working classes usually had a servant who would be a day girl or their niece or somebody who would come in to do that job of work, because that would be their experience for then moving on. So it was all over the place. But in order to really have a rewarding and financially and personally rewarding career as a servant, you really wanted to work in bigger houses with better career potential, with better ideas for preferment, with more challenging work as well. And Georgina was one of those few people that always did that. She always worked in houses that were substantial. And when she went in to go and work as a scullery maid, her only previous experience, apart from sort of probably charring for various people and helping her mother out, was working as a nursemaid. So although she would have been expected to prepare food for her charges in the nursery, nothing to do with being a scullery maid at all. So the fact that she impressed somebody, a housekeeper and a cook, well enough to be able to go into a kitchen, younger than most girls as well. She went in when she was about 14. Most scullery maids in big houses were 16 or 17, because the work was very, very physical, and because houses like that could be picky and wanted girls with experience. So she must have impressed somebody a great deal in order to get into that house at that age and in that position. Yeah,
no, she did very well. And I think this is when we first get an insight into the style of food of that time, which it just still sounds like a huge faff to me. I mean, you know, it was very, very fancy, and
it's bonkers.
And moulds, and you had to try and make food not really look like it how it was, but then they seemed to put loads of food colouring in and mould it to make it look like something completely different. In some ways it's glorious.
I mean, you can compare it to sort of Michelin-starred food today in some ways, where there's a lot of technical work that goes into it. So
a lot of faff.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if you're in the 1890s, restaurants where you can go out and take people to are still in their infancy, really. The Savoy was the first one, really, and that didn't get going until the 1890s. So the chances were, if you were entertaining, if you really wanted to impress someone, you'd invite them back to your house. And today we would probably think, right, I really need to impress this super important client. I'm going to take them to this 2 Michelin-starred restaurant in my town, and they're going to get this incredible food that's very technical, that's taken a whole team of chefs, probably 3 or 4 days, to sort of put together the various elements to produce this beautiful thing on my plate. So put like that and put into that context, it's sort of slightly incomprehensible. That said, the food is really, really, really insane in the Edwardian period. I mean, it's in some ways gloriously insane. And there is a sort of tension between stuff that is being promoted for, shall we say, the kind of upper middle classes and the nouveau riche, and the stuff that's being promoted as really cutting edge. So on the one hand, you've got Escoffier and Charles Herman Sen and chefs that we've still heard of today doing quite pared back things involving lots of seasonality, very complex sauces that take days to make, but are very much about the essence of flavour. And then you've got people like Agnes Marshall, and she's doing a sort of slightly more food colouring based version of the same thing. Escoffier's ham mousse has 4 ingredients, and it is perfect. It is the most beautiful ham mousse you will ever eat. Agnes Marshall's has got about 20 ingredients, including 3 that you can only buy from her shop, and it's absolutely took ages to make. Both of them involve pushing ham through a sieve in order to puree it, which is something still done in high-end restaurants today, but it does take a long time. Agnes Marshall's mousse is not as good as Escoffier's, despite the extra ingredients and the extra fuss and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, if you're eating Agnes Marshall's mousse, you know the work that's gone into that. So as somebody who's eating it, consciously or not, you are cognizant of the fact that they have employed a team of people to work for days to turn this out, that they are therefore wealthy, and that they are showing that wealth and showing that you are worthy of their wealth and attention when you take a spoonful of mousse.
Yeah, so that's the sort of status symbol of it, isn't it? As you've said, you know, the number of servants you've got reflects your position in society.
And the number of tiny little moulds with stupid things on. So the fact that you can't recognise your food anymore, that you've got absolutely no idea what's in it, is part and parcel of this kind of Victorian notion that nature should be controlled and brought to you in a tamed form. And this kind of Victorian idea that humanity now is really at its peak, that we control the globe, there's nothing that can stand before us, rah, rah, let's all run around with our sword and hit people. It's all those mentalities feed into the table. So it's a very domestic level. You see the stuff that's happening on a much more global scale. Yeah,
I see that. And I also found the comparison with what was going on with Paris really interesting, which is where her husband was born and grew up in a, you know, very much a family that was, they were pâtissiers. And, you know, I loved all those descriptions of what was going on in Paris. Some of it was a bit, you know, stomach churning. Do you want to just elaborate on what on earth was going on in Paris in the?
Well, mate, the elephants. Paul was much older than Georgina. He was 25 years older than her, really, but and born therefore in the 1850s and lived through the Paris Commune, which was this kind of cataclysm in Parisian history, French history generally. And this came out of the Franco-Prussian War. So Germany, for most of the 19th century, was a piecemeal selection of states. It came together under Prussia, formed what we now know as modern-day Germany. And as a lot of leaders do, they sort of decided a short, sharp war would be the best way to unite the country. So they went to war with France, the traditional enemy for most people in Europe, and did very, very well, marched through, surrounded Paris, laid siege to it, expected Paris to capitulate within days, and it didn't. The siege went on for months, and it was a proper traditional siege where they were aiming to starve the population. And like most sieges, the rich left as soon as they realised what was going on, so they fled to their holiday homes and sort of out to the countryside. And most of the people that were left were therefore kind of petit bourgeois or the poorer, the working classes. And as the siege began to bite, they genuinely did manage to starve the population to death. They were also bombing it at the same time. So you get these extraordinary depictions of feasts for those few rich people that are left, based on the Paris zoos, because the zoos were in places like the Bois de Boulogne, and they were out on the outskirts. So, of course, the animals were not safe anyway. Who wants an elephant rampaging through the streets of Paris? Much better, therefore, to make it into soup. So it's easy to laugh, and in fact some of the things you kind of weren't sure whether to laugh or cry, but there are also these awful depictions of families kind of huddling in basements because their houses have been bombed out, with one tiny piece of horse meat to last them all week. And the state of the people in Paris was absolutely parlous by the end of it. There's all sorts of evidence left from that era, including price lists of cat and rat, and there's a kind of dark sense of humour that runs through a lot of the writings of it, because it's all based on a guy called Henry Labouchere, who was a British politician who was writing about it at the time. And of course, being wealthy, he was fine, so his depictions are all tinged with this really black humour. But obviously, if you are genuinely starving to death in a basement, it's less funny. And Paul lived through that. His parents' shop kept going for much of it as well, because they needed to supply bread. And then when the Franco-Prussian War was over, the Commune of Paris then came in, which was a kind of couple of months, culminating in 1 week called Bloody Week, where estimates on how many people died vary hugely, but it was at least 10,000. And that was the French army against this utopian society that wanted to form a new Paris. And it ended in a bloodbath. The Tuileries Palace was burnt to the ground. That's why the Louvre now is 3 sides of a square rather than finishing on the one side it does. And then the martyrs were all hung upon Montmartre. So Paul lived through this incredibly bloody, very tumultuous time, which must have formed him quite significantly, because he was 14, 15 at the time, and would have been just about to start his own career as an apprentice chef. So quite interesting times to live through. And I think, as we all know, actually interesting times are kind of better to study than actually be there for.
Yes, yeah, definitely. The salami of rat was quite intriguing.
Yes. But you know, if that's what you've got, that's what you're going to eat.
You've got to make the best of it.
Actually, which is only a giant rat, so it was all right.
Yeah, it's lovely. I see myself as quite an adventurous eater, but I'm not sure I'd eat salami of rat. There we are. So how long was it before Paul came to London then?
He came to London in the 1890s. There's a kind of career trajectory for French chefs, which is really fairly standard, and you see it in the 1870s, you see it in the 1930s, you see it right up to the 1950s. So Jacques Pepin, for example, who is quite a well-known American, well, he's French, but works as an American chef, his trajectory was exactly the same as Paul's, just 100 years later. And the idea is you go into an apprenticeship, and it's a formalised apprenticeship at the age of 13, which your parents will pay fees for. You work for free. Often it's for a relative for kind of 2 or 3 years. Then you get a paid position, and you work around different restaurants in various different positions, working your way up, a bit like in domestic service. You work your way up through restaurants. And the idea would be to work in good restaurants in Paris, and then to head out to somewhere like Monte Carlo or Nice, where all the rich disappear for the winter. And there's an international kind of playboy jet set. The Prince of Wales, for example, later Edward VII, is always there because it's really nice, good climate, lots of attractive women. So you go there for a bit, and you might have a stint on the north coast as well of Normandy at some of the big casinos. And that's the idea. You work your way up, and eventually you open your own restaurant. And Paul did that for a while. He got married to a fellow cook, and then seems to have sort of fallen off the wagon somewhere. He was really difficult to trace. He was quite an interesting character because a lot of the archives got burnt during the burning of the Tuileries in the 1870s. So sometimes it's quite difficult to research French characters, but his military record survives in full, and from that you can see all of his addresses. And you can also pull up, obviously, the birth certificates of his children and see where they were born and what his profession is listed as. And French official documents have enormous amounts of information on them, as you would expect. The English ones slightly less so. But you can definitely see he goes through a wobble. He becomes a fruit seller at one point. And it seems to be that things go a bit wrong for him in Paris. He's now got quite a large family. So he decamps to England to try out his hand there, see what's going on. I mean, England, Britain generally, and also America actually, is mad for French chefs. French food is what's fashionable. French food is what people want. So French chefs can have a flourishing career in the Anglo-Saxon world if they didn't quite make it in the very competitive environment of France. So he decamps to Britain, probably worked in hotels for a while, and then ended up in the service of the Duke of Newcastle for a bit as well. So a checkered career, but certainly one that by the time he got to Britain was good enough and interesting enough for him to be able to claim that he was a very high-ranking chef. And certainly working for a duke, he was genuinely a high-ranking chef.
And Georgina, again, having sort of worked her way, she seemed to have this drive to work her way through and learn, and a continual thirst for learning. It seems like she has really embraced the French style of cooking as well, probably by necessity as well.
Well, it's kind of inevitable. French cooking was the top of society. That's what you wanted to cook. You wanted to be able to cook it, and it was what was regarded as what people wanted. There's also the gender imbalance as well. So someone like Georgina could never have worked for a duke, not until after the First World War. And realistically, even then it would have been rare. Before the First World War, if you were a woman, you'd struggle to work for anything higher than a baron. There were a couple of cooks who worked for earls, but not very many. Men were regarded as better. They were paid more. So she kind of had, it wasn't even a glass ceiling. It was really a concrete ceiling. And then when she met Paul, I think she genuinely married him out of love. He seems to have been an absolutely lovely bloke. And the photograph albums and the pictures and the anecdotes that survive about him, you know, he just seems a really, really nice chap. But there's no doubt as well that in marrying a leading French chef, she unlocked a lot more potential than perhaps she would have reached on her own. And she later said that she trained at his side. When they went out to work together, married in 1909, and when they started working together, which they did throughout the First World War and into the 1920s, she would have taken a step back to be working at his side. So she'd made cook by then. She was working as a cook in her own right. And obviously then going out to work with Paul, she would then be demoted, as it were, to sous chef. But she seems to have learnt so much working at his side. And she certainly spoke French, or at least sort of spoke French. She kept a manuscript recipe book from the 30s. And wrote down the titles of a lot of the recipes, and her I mean, she would have been educated. She was educated. She went through the schooling system, but obviously left school at 13. Her orthography is terrible, and her grammar is even worse. And she will write things like chocolate without the E, so she'll write it in the French way. And there are certain words that she clearly learnt through cooking, especially to write through cooking, that she only learnt in the French way. So her recipes are brilliant to read, but you do need quite a good understanding of French in order to fathom out sometimes what she's talking about.
Yeah. And I found it fascinating, this idea that they were sort of jobbing around. They were just sort of, you know, just they weren't linked to anyone in particular, and they were jobbing chefs, as you call them.
Yeah, and you get that a lot. You get a lot of people of Winston Churchill's level, you know, her ultimate employer, who could afford to keep a cook, but not a very good one. So when they threw parties, they wanted to bring on the best, so they would pay extra to have someone cater their parties, just in the same way that today we would arrange a caterer for a wedding or a garden party, because we wouldn't be able to, nor would we want to do it ourselves. So people would rent a cook for a week, for a weekend, sometimes for a whole season. Georgina later on, after Paul's death, specialised in catering for longish term events and weekends, and she would regularly work for a couple of months for the Newmarket season. So a man who would take a house in Newmarket and be there for the racing season, and she would cook for all those parties for that period of time, and then when it was over, she would go and work for someone else. So there was quite a flourishing market in being this kind of jobbing cook, and in many ways it was a lovely way to be, because you didn't have to live in, so you had your independence. You could pick and choose the gigs you wanted, and pick and choose therefore the money you earned, and the potential for earning was actually quite high. So she was almost certainly earning as much, if not more than she would have done had she gone in and worked as a live-in cook, but with none of those disadvantages.
And is that's how she got her job with the Churchills, was as a jobbing cook?
Yes, so they were a rackety family. They really were. They couldn't afford anything. They always spent beyond their means. Always. And you read, I mean, I thought at one point, wow, this is really interesting. I wonder why no one's written a book on Churchill servants before. And then I realised because they just don't retain them. There are all these receipts from employment agencies and, you know, everyone going, and they seem to be able to retain cooks for maybe a few months at a time, partly because they had no money. Clementine Churchill, who obviously is the woman of the house, was in charge very much of the servants. She would take on quite untried girls, and then she would train them up, and then they'd leave because they could get a better job with more pay. And you see this as a trope a lot in the 1920s and 30s. Miss Marple is always taking on girls to train up to be a lady's maid, and as soon as they get good, they leave. And it's a kind of constant theme in Agatha Christie. But so Clementine would take on these girls, and then they'd leave, and they'd have housemaids, and their attitude towards their servants was not atypical, but it still, to the modern eye, is a little bit, it doesn't ring nicely. They don't bother to learn the names of their servants. It's just the tall housemaid, or, you know, I think they know Annie, who's a scullery maid at one point, but she leaves in tears because, I mean, you know, it's just mad. They have a cook who goes insane and chases the kitchen maid around the kitchen with a knife. And of course they're keeping up two houses as well. They've got Chartwell, but they've also got a house in London, and they can't afford one of them, let alone two. So they're constantly shuffling staff, trying to keep them happy and try and retain them, and they don't retain them. So, and they never have enough money to afford decent people. So whenever they want to impress people, and Churchill was a man who very much wanted to network through dinner and understood the importance of networking through dinner. Whenever they wanted to impress people, they would either hire in the banquet. So they did garden parties, and they would rent all the food in from an outside caterer and rent the marquee and everything else. Or they would bring in a chef to cook for the whole weekend. And Georgina came to cook for them the first time in 1933, just to do a weekend initially, and then she did several other weekends and a couple of sort of stints of a week or more to cover for their normal cook. So it's bits and pieces here and there, but they couldn't afford to take her on permanently, because they wouldn't have been able to pay the wage that she would have expected.
So what changed? How come she went from being this sort of highly paid jobbing chef to then working for the Churchills?
The war, really. If you've got I mean, again, it's something that I suspect all of us who are freelance at the moment have suddenly recognised, that all those wonderful freedoms, when there's suddenly a crisis and there's no more work, you start to think, do you know what? A salary, a permanent job, that would have been actually quite a good idea. And so exactly the same thing happened to her. All of a sudden, there's no more work. All of her clients are, well, no one's throwing parties in the middle of the war. There are no more debutantes. There are no more 21st birthday parties because anyone who's 21 is off fighting.
Yeah.
She's already lived as well by this point, obviously through the First World War, so she was well aware of what could happen in wartime, that the big country houses would be mothballed or transformed into hospitals or training facilities, that kind of thing. So basically all her clients disappeared. And by that point, she was in her 50s. So I think it was a very canny decision to look around and say, okay, are there any of my clients who are pretty much guaranteed to hang on to a job for the war, who I don't mind working for, and where I'll get a bit of challenge? You know, the food I can cook would be quite interesting. And when you looked at the atmosphere in late 1939, Churchill was definitely in the running. I mean, you know, he'd been right up to that point, even though everyone had called him an old windbag and he'd been constantly going on about German rearmament. I mean, incredibly tiresome. It suddenly turned out that actually he had a point. So he was clearly going to be in the new government, and he liked to eat and he liked to entertain, and she had a good relationship with him and with Clementine Churchill. So I think it made perfect sense for her to offer her services, as Clementine put it, and go off to work for them.
Yeah, no, it's quite a jump, but I understand now, as you said, the backdrop to that, because well, basically her entire business strategy was
and they had a bit more money as well. I mean, during the war, they did pay her more than they paid their normal cooks, because especially once it became PM, but even before that, when he became First Lord of the Admiralty, he had a steady wage, which he hadn't done because he hadn't had a ministerial position for most of the 30s. He'd been out in the wilderness. So suddenly he did have some money coming in, and certainly enough to pay her a little bit more than she would have been able to earn, well, being unemployed.
Yeah. And obviously, as you've said, you know, Churchill liked his big dinners and his fancy food, although not too fancy. You don't want to upset the apple cart, do you?
No, well, he also didn't want to be seen to be having too fancy food, because he was a man who was well aware of his public image. So a little bit like certain politicians today who are photographed with their beer, even if actually they never touch alcohol, or get seen in a pub surrounded by crisps and pickled eggs, even if actually they kind of prefer to have, you know, caviar. It's exactly that kind of thing. The public image was so important. So while he did genuinely seem to prefer somewhat plainer food a lot of the time, it's a difficult one to work. The thing is, if you're used to eating caviar and plover's eggs, which he definitely was, and I mean plover's eggs were massive for him, then when you have a beef stew, you're more likely to talk about it. So he did use food very much as a way of cultivating his own image. And while it is quite clear that he did like his rare beef, and he did like his meat, and he did like his sort of plainish things, that tends to get talked about to the extent that all of the plover's eggs and the extremely fancy ice creams and the caviar and the moulded desserts and the beautiful souffles and the larks and the woodcock, all of those things are less talked about.
Yes. Yeah, it's I understand. I think the PR machine in its early days. And it also struck me quite funny. It made me laugh out loud, because there was a story about a parallel over in America.
Yeah.
Clementine had this wonderful cook chef, and she was turning out this amazing food that everyone loved. Whereas Eleanor Roosevelt had kind of taken a different tack with her cook.
Mrs. Nesbit was renowned. I mean, absolutely renowned. She was awful. I think Eleanor had quite a lot of work to find someone so bad to be in the White House kitchen. And there's a strong theory. There's a brilliant book by Laura Shapiro called What She Ate, which covers various different people. But she talks about Eleanor's intense dislike, verging on the hatred of her husband, who was having an affair. And so her reaction to this was to find the nastiest, most awful housekeeper cook she could find, someone who was not only a really bad cook but also quite an unpleasant person, install her in the White House. And Roosevelt, who loved food, was then sort of forced to eat this absolutely horrendous food. I mean, even Mary Soames, she was Mary Churchill at the time, but Churchill's youngest daughter, she's lovely about everything. Her diaries, which are in the Churchill Archive in Cambridge, are just the most wonderful document to read, because she's so unbelievably human in her diary. She's writing very much from the heart, and she's not really writing out of a sense of posterity. I mean, she clearly is. She kept the diaries, but they're just brilliant. But she's nice about absolutely everybody. She's a real joy to read. But even she says the food was just awful. And I mean, I went for barbecue at one point and quite enjoyed it. I think just because it was out of the White House, and therefore just having a sausage and not this horrific food was really lovely for them. But no, it was a very political decision. I mean, I don't suppose it did Roosevelt any good in terms of entertaining, but on the other hand, I think there was a kind of view that American food was terrible anyway, so people kind of braced for it, which wasn't fair, of course, to most American food. But certainly if you'd been to the White House, you wouldn't have come away with a good impression, I don't think.
Not anymore, I wouldn't imagine, no. And you describe life in number 10, and it's you know, it sounds mad again, it sounds frenetic, and I think what we forget is that, you know, she wasn't just cooking for them, she was cooking for the whole house.
Yeah, well, all cooks were.
Everyone.
And again, it's something that we fall into the trap of thinking about, because again, we see sort of Downton Abbey where the cook's nearly always finishing off beautiful dishes for upstairs. But if you're a cook, you're preparing food for everybody. I mean, hopefully you've got an assistant, and the assistant will be preparing the sort of lower dishes. But in terms of Downing Street, during the war, Georgina was cooking for the big banquets, the sort of the state banquets. She was also cooking for the family meals. So whether Churchill or indeed Clementine were eating separately or together, she would cater for those, often quite small suppers. Then she'd also be catering lunches, which could be formal or might not be. I mean, there were just this endless procession of people coming in and out. Breakfasts, obviously. And then she was also catering for a household staff that it fluctuated. It was probably around 6 to 8 people for most of the war. She wasn't having to feed sort of all of the hangers-on, so she wasn't feeding the sort of 300 people downstairs in the bunker, but she was nevertheless feeding a significant amount of people. And then after the war as well, when she continued to work for the family, again, I mean, you basically, she would have been turning out about 8 to 12 meals a day, because you've got 4 meals for the family: breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea, and then dinner or supper. You've got 4 meals for the lower servants, and often in a big house there would then be the upper servants would eat separately. Churchill's house wasn't big enough to have upper servants, so it was probably 8, but equally much if there were loads of other servants coming in because of visitors who also brought their servants who also needed to be fed, then there might be more than one sitting. So it's a factory. A kitchen like that has to be incredibly efficient, incredibly good, and also from a budgetary point of view, especially when you've got rationing in force, really good at managing provisions so that everybody is full, everybody is well fed, but also those that need to be impressed are impressed, despite the fact that, you know, there are no eggs.
And I think it sounds like Churchill did a good job of persuading, was it the Ministry of Food, to allow them to have diplomatic coupons to sort of top food supplies.
He didn't know what a ration was. I mean, he had to be seen to be adhering to it, and he was seen to adhere to it. And everybody pulled their ration books, so Georgina was in charge of the rations. But there were diplomatic coupons to allow for the extra expense of entertaining visitors, and there were always visitors. There were extra rations just generally as well for sort of the purposes of the fact it was big household, and therefore you get extra points as well. Again, that was about diplomacy. There was extra wine supplied because of entertaining, and then there were gifts as well that would come in. I mean, there was a whole primary school of class at one point that all sent Winston and Clementine eggs from the hens they had at their farm. And he also had a fully functioning kitchen garden at Chartwell, which was mothballed for the war. So all of the fresh fruit and vegetables that he needed would come up from Chartwell. Chequers, which was the prime ministerial residence and still is, had its own kitchen garden. So again, you've got fresh fruit and vegetables there as well. I mean, you know, if he wanted something, it would arrive. The king would send him sides of deer from Balmoral. I mean, in some ways, it's only the same that everybody else was doing. So if you are Mr. and Mrs. Smith and you live in Coventry and you've got relatives who live out in the Warwickshire countryside, your relatives in Warwickshire might send you some hens' eggs from their eggs, and you might have rabbits, so you might send them a rabbit. It's just that with Churchill, it's not a rabbit, it's like, you know, 12 grouse. So it's, and he had the money as well to be able to afford to buy the things that were unrationed, again, such as plover's eggs or endless Stilton. So the combination of money and connections.
A lot of champagne, by all accounts.
I love the fact they had a booze fridge.
Yeah. She was incredibly organised then, because I understand she had to sort of present a daily menu plan.
All cooks did. I mean, that was part. Some would do it on a weekly basis, but the idea would be that you would sit down in the morning with the mistress of the house, in this case Clementine Churchill, and an exercise book, and you would have written down what the menu would be, and you'd go through it to see what people's likes were and dislikes, what was available, what was good, what sauce people wanted, because obviously Clementine Churchill would know the likes and dislikes of her guests. She'd know any special requests. She'd know what she needed the menu to say, and Georgina would know the contents of the larder. So they would sit down together on a daily basis and go through that whole thing. And one of those menu books survives for the pre-war period, and you can see in it the cooks writing, Clementine scratching out what's on there, writing things in, and then Georgina's writing appears for one weekend, and it's beautiful when you come across it and just think, this she's arrived. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And obviously, you know, she follows them through the war, and as you say, afterwards. And you know, at one point, I think Churchill is at a different house to where she is, and Clementine writes in her diary that he's in such a foul mood because basically he hates his food.
Yeah,
so
it's just after the war, and he's suddenly been hit by rationing because suddenly there are no diplomatic coupons because he's not PM anymore, and he can't get over how little meat there is. And Georgina's off on a 2-week holiday because by the end of the war, everyone was just so unbelievably knackered. So all the household staff go home or go back to, as she did, to go and stay with her daughter, and he's just hit by a wave of depression. He's lost his job, the food's crap, he doesn't know what he's doing in life. He's also almost certainly got early onset dementia by that point. You know, he's already had a heart attack or two. It's not a great time in his life. But I think not having Georgina around to prepare him his favourite tidbit certainly compounded that.
Just before that, there's a lovely phrase about him turning to her at the celebrations for V-Day, or you know, Victory Day, and saying that you were part of that. I mean, that just must have been amazing for Georgina to have experienced.
She talked about it for the rest of her life, obviously. It was the day of his speech, the infamous V-Day speech, and he gave the speech and turned round and came back off the balcony. And she had missed most of the speech because she'd been cooking, and someone had said to her, "You could come on, this is like a really historic moment." So she came up and sort of stood there, and he broke away from this kind of crowd of men around him and came over and shook her hand and took her on the balcony and said, "I couldn't have done this without you." And she just said, of all the crowds and all the cheering and all the stuff that happened, those words, this kind of appreciation of her, she always called it her war work, so the appreciation of her own work and her skills, that moment sort of coalesced it for her. And she was, I mean, so few servants could put up with them as employers, and yet she stayed with them for 15 years and really, really struggled to retire, quite frankly.
Yeah. So, and still she goes on and off working for them, doesn't she?
She got terrible health. She was basically forced to retire through ill health, and then comes back again, and then she goes away again, and then they've got this other cook who, you know, is really just like floored by the whole domestic setup. She's new, she's young, she's been trained in the modern way, so to suddenly go to this drafty old mansion where there's a pantry and there's no fridge and it's just a nightmare, you know, she really struggles with this kind of antiquated setup. So Georgina's brought back again to cater for big banquets, not least today. Yeah, and because she keeps adding Bovril to her sauces, and Clementine spots it a mile off and sort of, what's going on, you know, Georgina would make a proper demi-glace. Well, yeah.
Yeah, no, that was interesting, and I think, you know, I read it also obviously in there about them getting blacklisted as employers because they were so powerful. So how on earth did Georgina survive all of this? What was it about her that kind of?
I think worked. She was a really extraordinary person, actually. I mean, one of the reasons I got into writing the book was because I met her granddaughter, Eddie, who is Britain's oldest Ironman competitor, and Eddie is a force of nature, and you can see in her, I think, something of what I imagine Georgina was like. She was just able to put up with everything, and I think by the time she worked for the Churchills, she'd seen it all. She'd been there, she'd done that. She worked for every employer under the sun. She'd seen the good, she'd seen the bad, and she knew what she wanted out of life. And I think she was a mixture of very determined and very, very capable. And a capable person will nearly always, hopefully, attract respect in the people they come across. And it's very obvious that she and Clementine formed within the sort of limits of the fact that there was a servant and employer relationship. They formed a friendship. There was a lot of mutual respect there. They got on with each other. And I think a lot of that was because Georgina was very skillful and very friendly. Everybody who talks about her, and of course there were lots of people that went through the Churchill household, nearly all of them mention her, and they all say, you know, what an extraordinary woman. She was always lovely. She could be sharp and she could tell people what was what, but she was invariably unflappably calm, and this sort of just oasis in the middle of everything going insane around her.
And I think what you're saying there really rings true with me, because you read so many stories about, like as you say, like Churchill doing this, Churchill doing that, other famous people doing this and that. But this story really kind of, it reflects the human side of actually what was going on, and that actually it wasn't really this them and us between sex, and they had to kind of get through it together.
I think as well, there's so much written about Churchill. You know, there's a kind of British obsession with Winston Churchill to the extent that everybody else gets ignored. And the obsession with Churchill is about him. It's not about the fact that nobody is an island. You know, Winston Churchill would have been nothing without Clementine, for example, who has been much ignored, really. There are biographies of her, there's some excellent biographies of her, but people don't talk about it very much. And then when you start to look at the wider network, I mean, for goodness sake, there's a book on his constituency party chairman. Really? But no one's looked at his servants. And yet, you know, how easy is it to be a great man if you've got this team of people making it easier for you?
Yeah.
You know, people sort of talk about standing on the shoulders of giants and all this kind of thing. Well, what about standing on the shoulders of the working classes, especially working class women who just don't get talked about or written about?
Yeah.
And I think what really appealed to me about Georgina, about her story, was not only the chance to put a different perspective on somebody that people are obsessed about, but also to triumph the idea of ordinariness, to triumph the idea that Georgina could have been any of our relatives. Nearly all of us will have somebody who worked in service in our background. And yet, you know, why is that any much less worth talking about than having a duke or a whatever else? So we spend so much time thinking about, I suppose, our great white men, something that is particularly pertinent at the moment with all the movements that are happening, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about other people, and yet we are all interlinked with other members of society, and they are all important in our lives.
Well, you certainly opened our eyes to, you know, what Georgina achieved, you know, as a working class woman from our area, and it just, you know, just goes to show what you can achieve with that determination, and obviously her capableness in the kitchen. It was really, really fascinating. And I'm
time for a blue plaque on the outside of the house she was born in.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. In Albury. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think Albury's changed that much probably since the mid 1800s.
No, physically I don't think it has.
Yeah. So no, lots of people should come and visit when lockdown is over, and read your book and understand a little bit more about the background. So like you say, how Winston actually was such a success in terms of his personal achievements, but Georgina was right up there with him. That was great, really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Massive thanks to Dr. Annie Gray and to Audrey Deane for that wonderful interview there. Now, if you want the book, give us a call on 01442 827 653. Now, Audrey Deane is also a published author on cookery matters. This is her book, The Slow Cooker Cookbook. So do give us a call on that one as well. All the details will be in the blurb below the video. Listen, we've got loads more author interviews to come. So do watch this space, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you very soon.